Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome back for the second half of our symposium today. So I'm being blinded here by the sunlight, capturing these few. Actually, we're blessed with sunlight in here right now, so this is great. Who even wants to be outside? Okay, we're going to have three speakers, just like in the morning, and Jonathan Hanahan, professor here, will be moderating the discussion. So I'll introduce him first, and he'll introduce the speakers in turn. Jonathan Hanahan is a researcher, critical designer, and educator. He uses technology to critique technology. His speculative practice explores the physical, cultural, and social ramifications of digital experiences and the role technology plays in shaping our everyday realities. Currently, Hanahan's research prioritizes alternative and ambient interfaces with technology. In 2022, he founded the Sensory and Ambient Interfaces Lab here, which investigates a future with fewer screens and how non-visual interfaces and interactions lead to a more digitally enhanced, yet less digitally imposed future. I'll stop the introduction there, although he has many more accolades, and I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Hey. Hi, everybody. Thank you. That was very nice, generous. Thanks for being here. Thanks for coming back after lunch in this, what will feel like a sleepy, warm, we'll try to liven it up a little bit. So this afternoon, to follow up on this morning, we're going to talk, bringing three really dynamic voices from across art, architecture, and design to discuss the evolving entanglement of physical and digital systems. So my hope is we can discuss how people engage and perceive digital entities and environments, and how artificial intelligences interpret a natural and evolving world. We will critically probe how this overlap is evolving, and more importantly, how it should evolve in productive, empathetic, and collaborative ways. So our first panelist is Carla Diana, a designer, author, and educator who explores the impact of future technologies through hands-on experiments in product design and tangible interaction. She's the founding head of the 4D design department at Cranbrook Academy of Art. And in addition to her studio practice, she is a design advisor for Diligent Robots, where advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning manifest in robot assistance to help healthcare workers. She's been a part of innovative design firms like Smart Design and Frog, where she worked on a range of products from robots to connected home applications. Her works appeared on the covers of Popular Science, Technology Review, the New York Times Sunday Review, and her books include My Robot Gets Me, How Social Design Can Make New Products More Human, and the world's first children's book on 3D printing. Her latest research is focused on autonomous vehicle systems and public transportation solutions. She holds a master's degree in 3D design from Cranbrook and a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from the Cooper Union. So please join me in welcome Carla.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm just going to set my timer here. So I'm excited to tie together, to be the glue between the morning and the afternoon, and tie together some of the threads that we talked about in AI and design. First, as a means of introduction, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, I am a product designer who's always been fascinated with how physical things can have behaviors when they are imbued with electronics or through projection mapping. So some of the things that I've worked on include the leading interaction design effort for Nito Robotics when I was at Smart Design. And then also I really enjoy doing things like this. What I get excited about in terms of exploring technology, I love to share back outwards through writing, through talks, and through projects. I try to create projects for myself that allow me to get some kind of hands-on experience with something that I'm fascinated with. And really, it's not technology, it is how we as a culture and a society are embracing new tools. So though I had been using 3D printers for many years in academia and also industry, around 2014 was interested in how we might have a future where 3D printers were more ubiquitous, as they are now 10 years later. And this included a children's book where the objects that are featured in the book then can be downloaded and 3D printed. So rather than this being about the printer, it's more about how we as designers could have objects that live entirely digitally, and then how those would start to show up in different parts of the world. In terms of some of what we heard this morning, we were discussing a lot of ideas around creativity and AI, or how we use AI as a design companion. And this afternoon's topic is a little bit more about how we look at ways of seeing and how we think about how this parallel between the human model and this machine model is almost does us a disservice in terms of how we think about computing machines. So I'm going to lay some threads through these few ideas, but first I just wanted to throw out what we saw this morning and how that has been relating to my own practice and that in my teaching. And I've been part of a number of discussions around distributed cognition, and what I'm seeing and experiencing is what we would call distributed creativity. So one of my side projects has been, I'm created the 4D design department at Cranbrook starting a little over 5.5 years ago, and it was the first new department in 47 years. So really the department focused on technology at this really historical place for making. And for me, that was really an ideal opportunity, particularly to be in a place that had such a history in making materiality and thinking about that. And so launching the department, I wanted to create a garment that I would wear for our opening party in 2019 to announce it. And it would be a musical dress that was really about motherhood. And I would allow folks to tug at this garment all around me and be different parts of this musical composition. And then at some point in 2019, all thoughts of party went out the window. So this has come back to me this year. So I'm very much in the middle of, and in the scrappy phases, but I've got the board coded, I've got the music composed, and I've been calling it the Modular Organized Tethered Harmonic Electronic Resonator. And so, I kind of threw that into Midjourney and came out with this, which was pretty exciting. And then I added some words around, I started out actually throwing the idea of this garment, this dress, and it came back, it never came back with what I had in my head. And then I just gave it this title, and this came back, and I thought, that's kind of cool. And then I got this, which the garment I had envisioned was totally not lighted, but this is what the AI envisioned. And so I'm in the midst of this so totally sloppy, late night side project thing. But it's been exciting to see how this image has started to influence what may wind up being the final version. I'm hoping to launch it for our Open Studios Day on April 20th, so stay tuned. And then, what's been interesting is to see how my students have been using AI. Much as we heard this morning, there's, and a little bit about Cranbrook. We have a contemporary art museum. We also have a science museum, and I'm really interested that then the two have been very separate. The Art Academy has been very separate from the Institute of Science. In some ways, I'm interested in bringing those together. And the idea behind the department is that we do work, our craft is form, code, and electronics. So everyone gets some familiarity with thinking about form and the semantics of three-dimensional objects, and is able to at least some model and simply craft a sketch model in physical forms. Code, being able to do some code, and electronics, and that work manifests in sound, light, and movement. It's a 2-year MFA that's entirely studio-based, and I get folks from all different kinds of backgrounds. So these are some examples of student work. We have a lot of folks interested in robotics, folks interested in 3D printing, like with the lighting fixture that we see there from Ryan Janina, folks interested in virtuality as well. We try to go back and forth between the virtual and the physical. So Vikram Kaladindi's piece is a sketch for an NFT, and different aspects of materiality. Chen Zhuo was working in ferrofluid, Meryl Norlander was working with folded fabrics and folded paper, Emily was looking at soft robotics, and what's been really challenging is that folks come to me from lots of different backgrounds. I've had folks like Michael Candy, who we see there in the center, who's now a researcher at UCSB and maybe coming back to Detroit to do some work with a group I'm involved with. He's an artist who is actually, frankly, one of the best engineers I've ever met, who came with an intense facility in robotics and some coding. And some of the folks have never touched a microcontroller before. I do have some ways that I look at the applicants in order to gauge desire for working with electronics and the coachability. But what I've been seeing is students who have never touched code before going to ChatGPT. And I didn't actually realize this was going on. And I would go where I have a woman in my class this year who's doing kinetic sculptures with wooden carved kinetic sculptures. And she had an ultrasonic sensor and Arduino code and everything set up. And one of the things that I really espouse is they are not learning a specific canon of things, they're learning how to learn. And she said, oh, I threw it into ChatGPT and it came up with this Arduino code. And I was amazed. I said, huh. So that's been interesting. But what I wanted to talk about today was more about this idea of seeing. So this book, My Robot Gets Me, How Social Design Can Make New Products More Human, has been a summary of my experiences as a designer over the last decade and a half or so. And what I talked about is my experience in working with robotics. So I had a year as a visiting assistant professor at Georgia Tech, where I met a woman named Dr. Andrea Tamaz, who was leading a lab called the Socially Intelligent Machines Lab that was really pushing the boundaries of how we might interact with computing machines in a completely non-code kind of way. Can we gesture? Can we have it gesture back? So this robot, Simon, was the first one that we did together. It's an amazing team, incredible PhD students working in artificial intelligence, and Andrea, who was leading the team, and Jonathan Holmes, who was our mechanical engineer, and I was doing design efforts. So like these shells that you see, or the entire architecture, should it have a head? Should it have eyes? And this was really an extreme because we were studying the social interaction. Eyelids that could blink, irises that could move left and right, entire head, a neck structure, fingers that could be articulated. And we were studying this social interaction. And from that, we've continued. This was, at one point, I got a call about both Dr. Tamaz and I have moved on to different institutions. She's actually co-founded a company that I'll talk about in a little bit. But this was a fun call. We want to do a cousin, Simon's cousin, thinking about, well, what does that mean? Familial, are they blood relatives? What? And then there was another project in the middle that wasn't designed from the ground up, that it was a kind of a Kinect camera on a stick with the more off-the-shelf components, and thinking about how do we make that friendly, how do we communicate the semantics of what it knows, what it can see, what it can't see, what senses it has. And then what's wound up manifesting in the last 7 years is a company called Diligent Robotics, which I was brought on to be head of design for in its founding days. And I've now moved over to the role of advisor. I still work on some very specific projects. Diligent was founded by Andrea Tamaz and Vivian Chu, both of whom I had met during my Georgia Tech days. And what they had learned is that the key factor, that there was a lot of interest in the healthcare sector because nurses were quitting in droves. They were literally hurting their backs. They were running up and down hallways. They were spending an inordinate amount of time doing things like standing inside of closets and assembling kits. So this is a robot that roams the hospital floors. It is essentially a storage cabinet on wheels with a very social top portion of the robot. And the AI comes into play for navigating the hallways, for interpreting social cues, for communicating back socially, and really for, every nuance of the way that this robot is behaving in the hospital setting. And I was very, very hesitant to want to design anything that could look overly cute for no reason, or seem like a doll, or seem anything like the sci-fi visions of robots that have heads and eyeballs, even though we learned so much from that, but that was never the end goal, especially for me as a designer interested in abstraction, pretty much, and from a taste point of view, interested in minimalism. So I always pushed back, but we had learned a ton. There was a lot of research that happened in the field, in the hospital, talking to healthcare professionals, and as well as Andrea and Vivian's deep knowledge in having run labs around social interaction with robotics. And it turned out that having something that people in a hospital setting, which is so hectic, so fast-paced, a place where people don't necessarily have the time to stop and remember codes, that just having this robot that could know if it was close to somebody, it could know if to say, excuse me, it could know to greet someone, and even just those few moments of a little bit of pleasantry actually kind of do have value. And but it's more than pleasantry. It's about navigation. It's about the social interaction. It's about the nuance of, if there's a spill, can the robot gesture that it sees the same thing that the person who's operating it sees. And it's been an amazing experience for me. There are one of the clients, and we're going to be doing a workshop in just a few weeks at St. Joseph's Mercy, is just a couple miles up the road from me. So I actually live in suburban Detroit. The company is in Austin, Texas, and have been able to visit. You'll see this little guy here. He's somewhere upset that he can't connect to Roblox. But we've been visiting Moxie in the hospital. I've been watching people interact with Moxie, and it's been really amazing. And so the application of the AI, even though we don't, this is nothing like what we were thinking about in terms of language. This is the language that this robot is using is entirely gestural and entirely about its own intelligence and how it sees and interprets the world. It's been amazing, and it's brought a lot of value. And I've watched nurses without them knowing that I had anything to do with this robot, which has been a really satisfying experience. I've watched nurses actually train other nurses. But Moxie is an example of extreme social intelligence, and AI plays a big role behind the scenes to craft all aspects of the robot's performance. My interest in writing the My Robot Gets Me book is around how can we abstract nuances of this? How can we take something like the head nod and put that in the motion of, let's say, a camera. Like I'm looking at a camera there that's articulated in front of me. How can we have it maybe bow its head and go to sleep to let us know that it's in sleep mode? How can we have it gesture so we know who it's focusing on and why? And getting back to the topic of this afternoon's panel around seeing, one of the things that has come up, periodically I get approached to do opinion pieces. I was approached by Popular Science in 2016 to do a piece around the Tesla autopilot and around some of the accidents that had been publicized. And just actually the piece wasn't about the accidents. It was just about Tesla autopilot and 100 greatest inventions of the year. And what I wound up really riffing on, and the piece is called Don't Blame the Robots, Blame Us, is that we set up this mental model and we watch a lot of science fiction, or some of us do, and can think about something like KIT and talking to the machine, having the machine be just like us. And now it's got eyes and it's got ears and it's got a brain, just like us. And that's where things really fall apart. And this is where designers play a big role. So If we think that the robot has human eyes and human brains, then we're going to make mistakes in terms of how much we trust it and how much we think that it does. And so it's up to designers to communicate that this is a robot brain and let us know what that robot sees and how it sees. So then in writing the book, way before doing the book, I had done an opinion piece for the New York Times that was called A Day in the Near Future, where I talk a little bit about some of these subtle interactions. Could we have a lamp that wakes us up in the morning? And many of these were credited in the piece as having been inspired by DIY folks in design labs, folks in HCI labs. So we've got the smart mirror, we've got a jacket that lights up and lets the other, has your directions and handlebars that vibrate, a smart pen, and it gets more and more fantastical, the home that greets you and the sous chef that helps you cook. But that really is the premise of the book. And what I was thinking about is how we shift from thinking about the product as a container of pre-programmed messages. I have a microwave, it beeps 3 times when popcorn is done, it beeps twice when my reheat plate is done, to having an entity that is AI driven and is coming up with answers on the fly and is actually continually learning and adapting. And how the book is really about how do we as designers think in a new way about crafting this so that we're defining personality, we're defining some parameters around behavior, but we're not doing a line by line definition of performance. And what does that mean? So I'm really interested in this, both from a creative point of view as well as from a cautionary point of view, because we're going to start seeing it. And I'm also interested in not having both seeing or communicating and language necessarily be human. So I talk in the book a lot about the importance of abstraction, communicating through light, sound, and motion, just like we work on in the 4D design department. So the book has a framework, and what's really complicated about a physical object is first of all, such a great team. I work with an amazing team at Diligent, and how many aspects of are there. So I've got lots of case studies from and these are all case studies, and some of them are interviews with folks, and thinking about presence, which is the physical form, followed by expression. How does the object talk back to us? Again, maybe not in English worded language, maybe in terms of light, sound, and motion that can be multicultural, that can be multicultural even in terms of robot ease. And I work with composers, I work with folks. So I've got a few examples, and I'm going to go through these quickly. Presence is the form of a thing. I worked with a drummer on a drummer's metronome that sits in the drum kit and isn't a little fussy box like he's used to. For the Nito Bot Vac, in some of our early sketches, we had created an entire language of typography. I worked with a composer to translate human words into the sounds. Context, I really, really stress how we don't have to have every movement, every interaction, every piece of information. Can we have just the sliver of web-connected information that we need in the context when we need it in? So this is the Clever Coat Rack. It's a project. Sometimes, I make projects for myself in my studio. As you approach it, it lights up. When you're not near it, it's just a wooden coat rack. There's a really thinly carved out piece of pine, and the LEDs shine through it. You see it, you know to grab what you need for the day, and it's a split-second interaction, communication between you and the object, or from the object to you. So what I'm interested in now is pushing myself and my students to think about how AI will start to change object behaviors. How will it be imbued into object information, object behavior? This is a piece by Matt Webb that's a project now on Kickstarter. He'd made a prototype and it got published in the Times, and there was so much interest. It composes a new AI poem every minute. So he's in the process of developing that. And Ray-Ban is working with Meta on smart glasses. So there's a really funny piece in the Times from the weekend about how well or not well this is working and what it might do for folks. And and also what I've noticed recently is a new piece of software by that's called Physical Intelligence, by a company called Physical Intelligence, building software that's a brain for robotics. So a lot of those experiments that were really intense lab experiments at Georgia Tech with Simon, for example, are things that are now starting to become more ubiquitous that folks can play around with, can try out. And my ultimate goal is to have us as designers have a critical eye towards these things. Play with them, understand them, really get a sense of feeling what they behave like in a visceral way, and make critical decisions about their creation. Thank you.
Wow. Okay. Where are we? Okay. Me again. Our next presenter is Catherine Griffiths, who is a media artist, designer, and researcher exploring the politics of technology. She seeks to make palpable, invisible, computational forces that shape power and structure social systems. Her creative research takes place at the intersection of critical code studies, social documentary, and algorithmic visualizations. By creating simulations, short films, video installations, and critical software pieces, her work reveals and contests normative logics of machine learning algorithms and thinks through new counter-algorithmic imaginaries. Her research has been exhibited at the Centre de Pompidou in Paris, and recent articles have been published in Perspective Journal, the Gradient Journal. She earned a doctorate in interdisciplinary media arts and practice from the University of Southern California, and a master's in architectural design from the Bartlett. And she currently teaches architectural design and digital studies at the University of Michigan. So please join me in welcoming. Thanks.
That was long. Hey. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation to come and share work with you, especially to Matthew. So I would define my work as being around critical computational design practices, and in that I focus on the politics of machine learning in society and developing custom software to think through and visualize those critical concepts. So I'm interested in exploring how machine learning is not only a technical issue, but also raises socio-political dilemmas, and is thus as much a question for the arts and humanities to grapple with and contribute to as it is for computer scientists to reconcile. So building off the interpretability problem in machine learning, I'm interested to create custom software, alternative video, interfaces to visualize for broader non-technical audiences, kind of layers of social, ethical, and political decodings. And much of my research practice looks at computer vision systems as investigative sites in which to intersect the spatial and the social and the computational. So my work could be understood as taking place at the intersection of what's sometimes described as critical algorithm studies with design. And so for me, this entails recognizing an algorithm as constructing an argument. You know, it has a viewpoint, and it might to achieve not only an extrinsic task, but potentially also an ideological operation. So in this short presentation, I'm going to very briefly show you 3 projects that explore different types of space. Public space, domestic space, and the workplace. And the first project looks at machine learning technology and its role in the futures of work discourse. So, and specifically drawing on the applications in the built environment. and their consequent shifts in labor politics. So I became interested in a suite of algorithms that are known as human activity recognition algorithms. They use kind of micro-surveillance of the full body to predict movement, and ultimately predicting our behaviors and our activities. And when put into a workplace context, this becomes a form of worker activity recognition. And they are speculated to become a big part of how workplaces are managed and how people are managed. And I noticed that the built environment, particularly construction sites, appear to be one of the testing grounds for autonomous worker management tools. So in this, I draw on the work of the sociologist Nautier Mars and her analysis and focus on the testing grounds of technology. So Mars argues that in many cases, it's not technology that's being tested often, but it's society is being tested. We're being tested in our relationship to the technology, what we'll accommodate, what we'll push back against. So I've been studying these vision systems that use image and video data sets to train machine learning models for this type of worker activity recognition. And the question is what the concurrent impact that they could have on labor rights in the workplace. You know, what rights have been established in the workplace that could be covertly shifted, maybe without agreement as a consequence of machine learning. So what you see here is some documentation from a prototype of an autonomous worker management system. So it's not applied yet in the world, it's still in development, for the construction industry. And it's meant to track not only worker activity, but also to then evaluate that activity in terms of productivity based on this kind of full body analysis. So my analysis critically contests some of these inner workings. So for example, unfortunately, I realize you can't see this in the slide, but what you see on the bottom left is the activity taxonomy table that the model is based on. And there's a series of classes listed of different kinds of activities, right? Like preparing materials, welding, fixing framework, things like that. And one of the activity classes is called resting. And within resting, it tells us that the algorithm is able to monitor and also evaluate when someone's standing still, when someone's drinking water, and when someone's wiping perspiration from their brow. So for me, there's a way of understanding here how an algorithm or a model in its sense has a value system embedded in it, a kind of treatment of the human body, and plays a role in work, labor politics, in terms of the futures of work. So as a process, I perform a critical code reading of the software and its training data sets to try and reinterpret these functions and its meaning from a more humanistic perspective of labor rights and relations. And then develop a series of visual simulations and interfaces that try to express these concerns. And for me, the work is questioning the assumed political neutrality and promise of certain concepts like Industry 4.0, pointing to a more structural dynamic in which machine learning, technological innovation appears to maybe roboticize the worker's body rather than liberating it from the arduousness of work. So the prospect of autonomous worker management systems precipitates the possibility of a new autonomous labor relations. And so my question is, in looking at these systems, is what is the landscape for labor rights and relations 4.0 to meet the landscape of machine learning in the futures of work? So this is an example of what I would call a reflexive software methodology that I employ. And it's about building an alternative software or an alternative interface to an existing prototype that visualizes and kind of contests some of these logics between different industries and geographic and cultural locations. So in this interface, The software is sort of trying to confront this disconnect between the technical agnosticism of developing a tool in a lab context versus the meaning that is imbued through social context when it's applied in the world. And then this scene in the software seeks to visualize what I call the dissolution of accountability in generative models, specifically models that are used as, so instead we've seen a lot today of diffusion models to generate images. But these kind of machine learning models are about decision making. So kind of different systems. And so in this sense, it's kind of, on the one hand, the interface is trying to challenge and engage ideas of what we call explainable AI, how to explain what the algorithm's doing. But also trying to point out the ways that machine learning in a workplace can kind of covertly reformulate workers' rights without agreement. So this is a visualization of like the whole network running in real time, and it reveals the impossibility of explaining decision-making when we understand that decisions are socio-technical. And then a third interface that I've been calling the unmodeled, it's actually visualizing a counter data set that I developed as a design proposition to try to reimagine an alternative model design which might be able to prioritize rights and well-being in the workplace. Okay, so the second project, it's somewhat in its early stages, design-wise, and it moves from the workplace to the intimacy of the home. So the research investigates the potential role of AI in a suburban home context. So I'm reflecting on ideas from xenofeminism and the prospects of AI on a kind of gendered labor in the home, or perhaps like labors of care, reproductive labor, but also drawing on xenofeminism to think about its liberatory potential as well. So this work experiments with a more personally situated narrative in which I filmed my own mother in her home, and then I reenact her domestic tasks as a motion data set. And I'm also developing this project as a multi-channel video installation for an exhibition in January. And the project takes cues from a feminist tradition of the portrayal of space, especially domestic space. So I've been interested in work referencing artists like, for example, Chantal Akerman, the filmmaker, especially her film No Home Movie, that's also shot in her mother's apartment. And working in part with sort of a combination of like a cinematic portrayal of space that's borrowed from a social documentary style of filmmaking alongside more computational and data aesthetics. So my point of departure is the reenactment of domestic space, domestic labor, in which I've used a motion capture system to develop this algorithmic rendition of labor. And the output of this process is the construction of a data set of 3D animated motions or activities, much like a library of digital assets or models. And I'm imagining ways to politicize these 3D digital asset repositories that are usually very kind of neutral, very apolitical. So thinking about the near future of the home as a space that produces data, especially this kind of video full body data, that are then used to train domestic robots and other types of machine learning devices that are set to enter intimate spaces, care settings, especially those of maybe unpaid or low-paid work. So this video has sound, but it's not so important, actually. So in developing a techno-materialist exploration of gendered labor in a suburban domestic context, I'm interested in what happens when AI penetrates the home more substantially. The privacy of the home is a domain that's becoming targeted by the looming vectorization of the body and private space. So here also thinking about the work of Meredith Whittaker, especially in her work on Prison Tech Comes Home. We know that technology that was originally developed for surveillance purposes in prisons, and the military is gradually sort of transitioning into the workplace and the home. So, yeah, I'll move along a little more quickly. Okay. So, the third and final project that I want to share with you moves into the use of computational tools in public space in the context of human rights and climate justice. So this project kind of takes off or is situated around the emergence of a very contemporary form of climate justice movement that we could trace back to December 2015 with this international agreement known as the Paris Climate Accords that attempts to set the global temperature to not rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius. And because of various countries' failure to keep to those commitments, there becomes this threat of what's being defined as climate collapse. So various groups have been working across the US and the UK, the Extinction Rebellion movement, Just Stop Oil, and they've taken on, I don't want to say a new form of tactics, because they're very much taken from successful historical civil rights movements, but they are a new form of tactic for climate justice movements, which is nonviolent direct action. So after a series of protests in London in 2019, over 1,000 people were arrested, or we should say consented to be arrested. And it was seen as so, let's say, viable an action to be arrested and to maybe spend a night in a police cell, that the government started to change the law around protest movements. So in 2023, the UK government changed the law to amend the Public Order Act to broaden this definition of what was disruption in public space, and ultimately gave the police sort of almost unlimited powers to shut down protest. It's this change in the law is known as Section 12. And so it directly connects a decline in civil liberties in the context of climate justice, because the law was changed specifically to address this new form of protest that was emerging at the time. And this garnered quite a lot of international press attention. And in following this situation, alongside my interest in the use of human activity recognition algorithms and their use in public space, I noticed this dichotomy open up. On the one hand, you have the threat of climate collapse, and on the other, you have the threat of climate activism to be successful in preventing climate collapse. So I started to see these two positions as almost like two ontologies, two worldviews that could be explored through the lens of artificial intelligence and how it's encoded to see these different perspectives. So I participated in some of these nonviolent direct action workshops, both in Washington, DC and in London. And then during the summer of 2023, I worked with a climate activist group in London called Just Stop Oil. And so with their agreement, I participated in this nonviolent direct actions while also documenting their tactical operations. So on the one hand, I'm situated in the project with stakes as both a citizen but also a researcher. And one of their most visible tactics that's gotten the most attention is slow marching, blocking roads, specifically in central London, which leads to a kind of non-compliance with this new Section 12 law and ultimately the instigation of arrests. And so in doing this work, I've been using the idea of ontology as a design tool to think through model design, training data sets, and the possibilities of activity recognition in public space to contest civil rights. So ontology, for some people, is probably more associated with the field of philosophy, but in computer science, it's also a way of defining a sort of a world view of a model, or what a model understands. What are its epistemic boundaries? What are its competencies? How are the rules defined? What's the hierarchy of information between different classes in a model? So, as you can imagine, it's singular and rigid, and it's hierarchical often. And this kind of ontology, at least on the left, struggles with indeterminacy and with humanistic entanglements. And so I've been trying to build a second ontology as a kind of design proposition for how else these algorithms could understand public space, more from the perspective of the threat of climate collapse. And so this is video data that I have analyzed with a skeletal recognition algorithm. And so the work is examining the prospect of AI gate surveillance technology in relation to civil resistance in public space, situated within this looming threat of climate collapse. And the idea of a counter-ontology, a counter-algorithm, sees tactics such as, for example, here, it's called a grounding circle. It's an important kind of care practice that activists do before they go out onto the road and slow march. So this ontology would register the emotional labor, the psychological preparation involved in this kind of work. The kind of emotional labor, we could say. So this video has sound. I don't know if you can play it. No, okay, it's fine. I'll just skip that one. So just to kind of wrap up with this, I want to show you a video clip. It's very much sort of work in progress, but an attempt to kind of tell the story of this Section 12 police charges and the process of activists sort of being arrested on the road, but also pleading not guilty, I should say, to the charges that force a trial, and ultimately preparing a legal defense based on the legality of this Section 12 law. And so this is a still from the body cam of a senior police officer who will, at the time, have enacted this Section 12 order and ultimately turned the protest from one of being legal to illegal. So this video has audio from the police body cam, so you can kind of hear a bit about what's going on the road and the sort of commotion and chaos and things. But ultimately what I wanted to share it with you is because I've been trying to use video evidence like this alongside new kind of tools that sometimes are called automated annotation tools. So the kind of annotation tools that support the development of building training data sets. And where it might be kind of much more obvious in building a training data set for, say, object recognition, where you're just labeling an object in a video. In this case, you're trying to define how to label space that's also changing its legal definition over time. So I've been working with automated annotation tools to think about this, also in support of people who are preparing their trials and trying to contest this kind of legal, challenge this new law. So I've just realized I can't, oh yeah, you can kind of see the automated tool come in here. And at some point it kind of changes color and changes condition when the police officer sort of changes the status of the protest. But I can't scrub it along. I don't seem to have access on here. Otherwise, I don't want to show you the full thing. It's about 5 minutes. But anyway, I'm interested in these tools as sort of like rethinking space according to machine learning logics and how to build their data sets. Okay, just to wrap up. So as a kind of practice towards a critical computational design, I'm interested in kind of looking at algorithms that are already situated in a specific geographic or cultural or political context and from which their meaning can't really be meaningfully extracted, to sort of counter the context agnosticism that computation has historically taken. And then thinking about reflexive software as a methodology to critically reflect on code and its processes, and unfolding algorithms into more socio-technical implications. And then counter-algorithms, for me, becomes a design propositional approach of how to build counter-arguments through software. And I'm actually a little bit over time, so I think maybe I'll leave these slides for the talk later. But thank you.
Okay, our third speaker on this panel is Andrew Witt, who is an associate professor in practice at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, teaching and researching on the relationship of geometry and machines to perception, design, construction, and culture. Trained as both an architect and mathematician, he has a particular interest in the technically synthetic and logically rigorous approaches to form. Witt is also the co-founder of Certain Measures, a Boston, Berlin-based design and technology studio that combines imagination and evidence of systematic and scalable approaches to spatial problems. Witt is the author of Formulations, Architecture, Mathematics, Culture. He's a fellow of the Canadian Centre for Architecture and a Graham Foundation, MacDowell, a Graham Foundation, and Harvard Data Science Initiative grantee, a World Frontiers Forum Pioneer, among other awards. So please welcome Andrew.
Moment of truth. I think I might be the only one who hasn't tested the setup before, so we'll see. Always high stakes. Okay. Well, it's a real honor and pleasure to be with you today. Thank you, Matthew, for the invitation. So today, amidst future-oriented, future-saturated rhetoric related to AI, I want to talk a little bit about how data might change the way we relate yesterday and tomorrow. Through voracious data collection, AI models have now become, as Matthew alluded to, vast repositories for collective cultural memory. And also vehicles for reanimating and remixing the ghosts of the history of architecture. They allow us to increase the resolution of our past imaginations as never before, and use the past not simply as a reference, but actually as a medium. The past becomes a kind of signal that we can process as many other signals. So in their essay, Notes on Metamodernism, Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin van den Akker describe an emerging structure, quote, an emerging structure of feeling, a new narrative of longing structured by a belief that was long repressed for the possibility of a better future that was long forgotten. This in contradistinction to postmodernism, the sort of like cynicism, I guess, of postmodernism. If the postmodern deconstructs, new tendencies are concerned rather with reconstruction. Skepticism of grand narratives, close quote, skepticism of grand narratives have been confronted by the existential necessity to respond with grand responses to global crises. The techniques of metamodernism and reconstruction omnivorously and unironically oscillate between endless poles of culture, technique, and style to create patchwork ecologies, stitching together disparate elements in new assemblages to confront these challenges. And I would argue that AI, with its endless ability to classify, relate, chart, suture together, vivisect, combine, create metaphors around, and chart nuanced inflections of the past and present, is the ideal media expression of that metamodern sensibility. But I hope to ground the conversation on architecture's historical approach to data, and perhaps one particular kind of data set, the so-called gallery painting, which itself depicts dozens of other paintings. So in his 1757 pair of paintings of Rome, the architect Giovanni Panini offers a kind of Pinterest board of Baroque classicism, an implied data set of architecture organized by the eye of the collector. So today, we think and design in exactly these kinds of image matrices. And vast collections exist for every conceivable building style, type, element, and material. Styles such as the Beaux-Arts, which were once communicated through a canon of a few exemplary drawings and buildings, can now be summarized through exhaustive data sets of every instance, a sort of population approach to style, if you will. And AI brings to these data sets a vast capacity for pattern recognition, comparison, sense-making, and ultimately mapping. It offers new ways to chart the extended world of architectural creativity, and new ways to find our place within it and potentially beyond it. So the tools of cultural analytics of the past thus become really essential to sort of understand this flood of data. Digital photographs and images are a form of historical catalog, matrix, and data set that are uniquely amenable to data science analysis. And AI gives us fresh ways to look through them, or to look at them, to see them, and furnish a kind of atlas of form that reveals stable and variable aspects of their stylistic elements over time. So such techniques could readily be used to compare in forensic detail the Gothic, Baroque, or any specific syntactically particular architectural genre. So AI allows us to think about the remixing and recombination of such styles, not at the level of collage, but instead at this level of sort of an integral reconception, an integral sort of recasting of them as one sort of continuous entity, or continuous sort of epistemology, I guess, in multipolar and, I would argue, meta-modern ways. So there's a strange return to maybe something that's nostalgia adjacent. So this is a study by a current MArch thesis student, Ryo Kobayashi, that took a series of fine-tuned models, so models which were sort of off the shelf but had been augmented with very particular data sets for specific Japanese sort of historical styles, and then applied those to imagine how pairs of those styles, dyads of those styles, could begin to make proposals, make architectural proposals, or what the kind of proposals that would emerge from those dyads. So standard neural models are thus inflected and extended with a specific authorial hand to create and tune patchwork hybrids in calibrated and exact ways. And these are hybrids not only of sort of visual output, but actually hybrids of a kind of intuition, a kind of sensibility of those different styles. So we're in our office and in my research very interested in extending machine learning pattern recognition to the scale of architecture as a whole. And so what you're seeing here is one of a series of projects that we call Machine View of the City. It uses a bespoke 40-dimensional ML classifier to scan all of the buildings in central London and begin to create a kind of metamorphological map of comparison, right? So instead of organizing these buildings by geography, you're organizing them by form. You're creating a kind of family tree of form which is emergently determined by the visual and spatial and structural qualities of the underlying architecture. It begins to map out the space of morphology itself. So this sort of ongoing research project looks at cities in sequence and also begins to say, how do those cities, what are the sort of commonalities and differences among those cities from a purely morphological point of view, from a purely sort of stylistic point of view? So we've looked at London, Berlin, Boston, Liverpool, Tokyo, and Shanghai to try and create these, this more extensive, epistemic map of the history of architecture. So our system creates these map-like representations, these kind of cartograms that don't chart the sort of specific context of a building, but instead sort of think about the relationship of buildings themselves with every other building which has been, or which is in a particular city. It really begins to locate in very particular detail what it means to be a particular kind of building. So these methods of building form classification can be used to rethink our approach to historical preservation. So a couple of years ago, we were asked by the Office of Urbanization at Harvard to take on a project where we applied these kinds of methods to try and create a census of regional Chinese building typologies. And so this is a census that had never been undertaken before. Many of these typologies there were sporadic examples, but nobody really knew how extensive they were. And so what we did was develop and train 18 different specific classifiers to identify these specific styles in 18 different regions across China. And so what we could do with this is actually get a much better understanding of the sort of population of those historical artifacts, of those historical architectures, and then begin to think about, okay, if we're going to preserve this as a population, we don't need to preserve only the most exemplary examples. We have the complete map. We can now think about the sort of specific outliers in that map, which collectively define the population. So here you can see the sort of like composited images of a series of inferred plans of those building footprints. Once we had the building footprints, we trained another 18 neural networks to infer what the interior plan of that architecture might look like. And so in fact, what we're doing is sort of imagining, or we're creating a kind of population sort of taxonomy of each of those as typologies. And here you see a sort of self-organizing map that shows all of those typologies in relation to each other. We could think in somehow like a more, I don't know, I hesitate to say objective, but a much deeper way about the relationship between building form, type, and history. And so what's happening is that the ways in which human and machine seeing is engaging with the world are increasingly converging. So when we think about sensation, vision, legibility, drawing, data, all of those sort of phenomena are circling around a sort of convergent set of issues and representations. And so what we're trying to do in our work is sort of like locate how the human and machine think about, analyze, respond to, classify, and relate images. So what we're trying to do also as a part of that is open up the black box of AI to reveal the inner workings of machine perception, as you see sort of on the right, and you have the human sort of legible image of the same on the left. So you see the specific weights, the activation maps, all of the sort of like technical minutiae actually of how those images are being generated, exposed so that we can begin to understand, if not exactly what's going on, at least some sort of intuition of what's happening under the hood. So underlying all of this, I think, or leading all of this sort of research sort of led to a kind of recovery for us of this idea, very old idea of spolia in architecture. So spolia is a fragment of a past architecture reintegrated into a new whole. And so it's a very common sort of feature of not only classical architecture, but various manifestations of architecture really up until almost the modern period. And what we can do with machine vision systems today is kind of like think about the kind of like epistemic spolia that exists through these classification data sets, and that we can create with these sorts of scanning processes. So recent AI tools like Facebook semantic segmentation allow us to anatomize images and scans with incredible taxonomic precision. So as it turns out, recently there's been considerable progress, not only in creating data sets of things that we know and love, like cats and people and everything else, but also quite a bit of interest on the taxonomization of waste, of garbage. It's this sort of like very denatured kind of information, this sort of like leftover information, which is sometimes very hard to classify. There's a very interesting data set called the trash annotations in context, which actually applies machine learning to this process of waste classification. So this is contributing to an emerging space of computational reuse empowered by this AI tech. New forms of scanning, including the internal scanning of materials like wood to evaluate structural integrity, promise to revolutionize how we source and make architecture, opening up the promise of a truly kind of cyclic process of material reuse. So this comes as the architecture industry in particular, has to confront the enormous volume of construction and demolition waste that it's produced, something like 30% of global landfill volume. But what if AI might hold the key to turning this waste actually back into the cycle of building? So that impulse was this sort of catalyst for a series of projects that we called Mind the Scrap. So Mind the Scrap is a data-driven process that designs new structures from existing waste using a 40-dimensional machine learning engine to analyze and stitch together irregular construction scraps into new forms. So it takes this very old idea of quilting and essentially applies computational methods to this problem of waste. It finds the unique best use of each piece in a new structure through this process of scanning and classification and computational geometry. And with it, we can match what we have with what we want to build and find beauty and intricacy in that neglected waste. I think there's also a kind of like meta level at which there's some like apt embodiment of the sort of like ethos of AI and ML in a kind of artifact that has this kind of like patchwork assembly, right? Where you see the sutures, but still it has this kind of integral whole. So Mind the Scrap is basically using big data and ML to tackle big waste. And we've had a couple of different manifestations of this project. We did a larger piece recently at the AI Art Center in Shanghai, which is a gallery sort of specifically devoted to machine learning and art. So we've taken our process a little bit further by disassembling existing buildings and scanning their components to create catalogs of waste as a resource. So here we see a disused vacation house from an East German nudist colony, which is sort of separate lecture, but which we deconstructed and then exhaustively cataloged. And here we're looking at not only sort of the geometry, which is relatively stable, but we're looking at the weathering qualities. We're using sort of like image classification processes to really be very nuanced, actually, about inferring the quality of the underlying material. This is sort of an aside, but one of the biggest problems, actually, in computational reuse is the grading of used materials. So how can you grade it structurally? How can you ensure that it's not too weathered? How can you ensure that it doesn't have parasites or other sorts of issues? So the forensic quality of this scanning allows us to sort by color, texture, shape, and so forth, and allows us to sort of think about the building as a temporary state of matter. And so really what we're doing as designers is, of course, we're designing an artifact, but we have to take a longer view of the process, maybe the 7 generations view of the process, where we're designing what comes before and ultimately what comes after. So these pieces can be dynamically recombined, kind of like Rubik's Cube style, into new architecture. And so here you can see a sort of like full-scale reconstructed corner of one of these ML-generated houses, which was at Futurium in Berlin. And one of the things that I actually enjoy about this prototype is you're reconstructing not only the exterior, but also the interior, this sort of like patchwork of 70s era wallpaper. It became the site of a couple of fashion shoots. I know this feels a little bit like a Halloween fashion shoot, but anyway, it's been fun. With the database of scrap, by generating this database of scrap, architects are designing not only buildings, but actually almost like data visualization and navigation systems that allow you to sort of see in this universe of endless combinations what the sort of like best fit or the sort of like most felicitous version for your specific values actually might be. And so as you might have gathered, all of the things that we produce have both sort of like a physical element and a digital element. The digital element tells the story of a kind of like intuition of how computationally those artifacts happen. So ultimately, we might imagine huge planetary repositories of construction waste. So by scanning building stock around the globe and generatively creating new scenarios for their reuse, we can begin to imagine the future states not only of our buildings, but also our cities and our planet. So what I think is intriguing or suggestive about that kind of work is that AI is a way not only to sort of like signalize or transform that entire history of architecture into something that can be modulated, it's also a way to signalize or make a little bit more fluid technical processes over which architects have historically not had a lot of control, right? So AI allows us to extend our ability to actually interact deeply with processes and systems and techniques which have been heavy, right? And so, and potentially, in so doing, it allows us to expand the scope of architecture to think about not only the material cycles of the building itself, but also the living systems around it. So this is a little bit more evocative animation, but I think it's sort of like, I don't know, philosophically someplace that we hope to go, where we begin to think about the processes of living systems as an integral part of the architecture itself. So, thus, a meta-modern way of using AI vivisects data, nature, culture, and hopefully creates a path to help us flourish in an ecology that connects human and machine, past and future, architecture and world. And just as we've passed from the postmodern to the meta-modern, perhaps architecture is finally leaving behind its ironic and detached post-digital phase to emerge towards something that we might call the meta-digital, one that plots a tomorrow or hopes for a tomorrow where the bounds of architecture extend to the limits of data itself. But that means it encompasses not only building, but our way of relating to the planet, our past, and our future. Thanks.
Where do you want us?
Well, I don't want to make anybody sit in the sun if you don't want to. So maybe, okay. We can shift as we go, so everybody gets one chance in the sun. Wow. Okay. Thank you all. That was awesome. I have this moderating thing is going to be interesting for me because, as my students will know, when I'm in a conversation around something that I'm very excited about, I'm very bad at not talking. So if I'm holding my mouth, it's because that's the only way I can keep myself from not jumping in. So I'm not sick. I'm just in preparation for this, I returned to a bunch of resources that really inspired the way or influenced the way I think about technology over the spring. So one was returning to the Matrix trilogy, which in high school, I mean, not to date myself, completely defined what technology really meant to me, and also defined it as like an occupiable space. But also to recently rereading James Bridle's two recent books, New Dark Age and Ways of Being. And what I realized out of all those things is that the really important question is not necessarily what is the technology, but more what is our relationship to it, right? And the idea that our relationship can be productive, it can be destructive, it can be collaborative, etc. And as we were sitting here, I mean, a year ago we had our first symposium was here, and I found that conversation was very much around like, it was at a time where, you know, ChatGPT was still like bandwidth throttled, like you couldn't really get on it. Very few in the audience really had enough time to have experiences with these things. And a year later, I think everybody in this room has some sort of relationship with AI, both as a creative practitioner, but also just in life, either by choice or not, right? So the first question I wanted to ask and this came up a little bit earlier about some of the semantics of how we describe this relationship, I think are really important. And I've focused a lot on the difference between, very often we use this idea of designing or making with AI or using AI to make things interchangeably, but actually they're two very different things, right? They sort of establish a, designing with is a more horizontal approach, right? It sort of like embraces a relationship, it's collaborative, whereas using sort of reestablishes this idea of colonialist thought or Western thought about like, I am smart, do the things that I don't want to do, right? So my first kind of question is just like, how do you, both as a artist, designer, architect, and as just a person, like how do you define your relationship with AI? And how has that evolved through your process over the, particularly the last year, but in the past from as that has evolved itself?
So I think I would just offer to that idea. So I ran out of time, so I couldn't show a couple of slides at the end of my presentation, but they were 2 slides that are kind of, or 2 examples of, at least in the US context, where the kind of policy space is around the development of autonomous management systems and this space. And so what I was going to add is that some of my work is part of groups, interdisciplinary groups, who are trying to sort of pass those. So one is the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that was put out more than a year ago, now about 18 months ago by the US government, and then followed up about 6 months ago by a very extensive executive order on what they're calling trustworthy AI in the US. And then in other countries, it's defined slightly differently, and they're maybe a little bit ahead policy-wise. So I guess it's been interesting to be part of some of these groups, to try to pass these documents, to understand kind of where policy making is around some of these, and also some of these points, and also that there seems to be increasing interest in having people from the arts and design to offer a kind of interdisciplinary position. So whereas not that long ago, it seemed that it would only ever be maybe a social scientist or someone in that space, or anthropology perhaps, or with computer science. And so I guess my offering to this point is the kind of making with AI is to some extent around thinking about these interdisciplinary groups. So it's not just like using a tool and finding the human AI collaboration in that sense, but sort of how the sort of collaborative map in a sort of more societal sense of using AI or working with AI.
Yeah, I mean, this is, it's an interesting semantic, this thinking about when I start a new robotics project, I have this continuum that I map out that goes from self to other, and thinking about, are we designing something that we want people to interact with as an agent, or do we want it as essentially a prosthetic? And I think in my own just nascent experience over the last couple of years, it's felt almost like accidental prosthetics, like when I look at the dress project, for example. I think I really started that thinking, let's see, like what kind of images, and the reason that I show that even in the rough stages of it is that it surprised me how much I was influenced by the images that were generated, and how I can see now a back and forth, even though I went into it with with a using. I went into it very much with a using, and that's the way I had been approaching it. And There have been workshops with my student group at Cranbrook where we had folks from the Near Future Laboratory come in and have us use this image generator to imagine the future of Detroit and things like that. And I'm just finding now that I look back on the process, it is more of a width. And then I guess the story that I told about my student learning Arduino, that's, like I said, one of the struggles is that we don't have this traditional class structure, course structure. But I do Arduino workshops at certain periods of time. But so coming upon this student who said, "Oh no, I did this," and and then of course I had to follow up on it and say, well, this sensor isn't quite right, and there was an enormous gap in knowledge from the approach. But essentially, without knowing it, I had been teaching with AI because as a group, as a whole, this now has become an approach to how the students are gaining knowledge, and then I'm using it as a way that I then craft how our studio is using the tools. So it's become very blurry.
Yeah, I think this question of with, or maybe like who this AI is if we're working with them, it's intriguing, and I think there's a couple of different frameworks that I've found useful recently. Actually, the sort of like almost like domestic labor framework is a really interesting one, because actually there's a long history of domestic robots, if not sort of like an actual fact, that at least in science fiction, and in many cases since the 50s, some attempts at domestic robots. And it's interesting to sort of like look back at those accounts and think about how they're documented or justified. And often they're justified by a role that they take on. They're the butler, they're the chef, they're the housekeeper, they're something like that. So I think as we think, that level of nuance in roles, it tells us something about what we expect from that AI. And I think to think about AI, we need to think about it beyond a collaborator. We need to say, okay, what kind of collaborator is it? So, and one aspect of that which I've found kind of, at least for me, kind of intriguing, is to think about these various models as translators. We've already talked a bit about metaphor and the sort of use of linguistics in this context. And models are literally mappings from one high-dimensional space to another high-dimensional space. They are translators. That's what they do on some level. And I think in our practice, where the design of workflows and the design of processes is really sort of like our métier. It's what we do, and the products, the sort of artifacts of architecture, they're not incidental, but they're sort of outputs of that. It suggests that these translators are things which exist in a much wider ecosystem of tools and processes and practices. And so I think the AI is not a sort of like specific entity which comes in as sort of like exclusive to all others. It's something which fits within the framework. It's something that fits within a kind of team, if you will. And so that idea of it being a translator, actually, I think is one specific way in which it's been super useful to us.
To kind of piggyback and actually, Catherine, something when you brought up the policy for truth or trustworthy AI, I think a big question that comes up is, what is the relationship of how do we establish trust and empathy in that relationship, both with AI and the processes that you're using, from a policy perspective, from a medical perspective? I mean, I think there's so many interesting questions around, like, how does somebody in a compromised state trust this artificial thing to care for them? And then also in a material sense is what you're showing of the opportunity to reuse all of this is so interesting, but being able to confirm that it's viable. You're talking about pests. So I'm just interested to hear about how you're wrestling with those relationships, both in your practice, but also in just as a human.
Since I have the mic, I'll mention one or two quick things. So there's a lot of really interesting things from critical software studies that become obviously very relevant for AI. And one aspect of software process is called verification and validation, or validation and verification, depending on which you prioritize. And it's a really critical part of the software process, which can sometimes take 30, 40, 50% of the time of actually developing software. I think what's difficult, that process is always a little bit challenging because you're essentially testing on a very small subset, a very large set of cases that something might encounter in the field. But what's interesting is that AI also allows you to produce synthetic data sets, which can allow you to verify that system much more rigorously. So like, for example, in testing self-driving cars, you're not only taking the car sort of out into the field, you're taking that AI system, putting it in a sort of like digitally produced city, creating sort of scenarios that could happen but don't in the real world. And so you're world building. You're creating an artificial world to see the viability of that AI. And I think you're encapsulating it in some way in that world. And that's what I think is actually intriguing about the process of this new process of validation and verification, is that it demands building worlds. It demands a more expansive understanding of how we think about agents and how we sort of, rigorously address or sort of evaluate their fitness.
Yeah, and then what your question has made me think about that I've really grappled with throughout my career is, some of the case studies or even just anecdotes that I mention in the book involve vulnerable populations. Like I talk about, there's something called LEQ, and I have an interview with the CEO of the company, and it's a tablet interface that's accompanied by kind of this robotic form that physically, that addresses some of the cognitive challenges in navigating the complexities of screen-based interfaces, multimodal interfaces. It offers reminders. It says you're getting a call. Do you want to do this now? It's time for you. And then can sort of point the person towards the screen-based interface. And I see that as something that can be very helpful with someone with cognitive disabilities. I have an anecdote also about my son when he was less than a year old. And was would sleep in a room when the shades were drawn. You couldn't tell what time it was, but so I had this lighting system, and it was just amazing to me that he and I could communicate without language around what time it was based on this programmed lighting system. Even though if it was overcast, well, it's still time to get up. It's still 7 a.m. And so I see so much value there, particularly what I was talking about around nonverbal communication or ambient interactions. And at the same time, it's just incredibly critical that we as designers or entrepreneurs or anyone involved in bringing artifacts into the world be sensitive to particularly vulnerable populations and to what can happen with particularly around cognitive disabilities, I think, or emotional challenges with empathy and designing an interface. Like the goal is to design the most empathic interface, but in doing so, are you then seducing a person into something, and how do you as a designer navigate? You can always walk off the job if you kind of realize that the ulterior motive of the interface isn't something you agree with, but how much control do we really have, and will the next designer just take it over? And I know it's a big question.
So I think that your project with a robot, kind of experimenting with a robot in a hospital healthcare context, is a really interesting one to think about around trust. Because also the sort of framing of the project and the way it's able to be tested out with both, say, like a patient community, but then a health worker community. And so I find that a really interesting example. But in some of the contexts that I've looked at, I think trust plays out differently. So for instance, on the one hand, in say a worker management tool example, sometimes it feels like the role of the worker in having any kind of influence in the design of the tool or application of the tool is almost non-existent. And if you whilst many tools are presented as being about safety, it doesn't take much digging to realize they're really about productivity. And that safety is this sort of veneer or marketing tool, at least in a US context. Maybe in other parts of the world it's different. And to some extent, the benefit to the worker is almost non-existent. There's almost no benefit to the worker in some tools, or it's difficult to find one. So I guess I'm interested in, when it comes to trust, sort of how you design those testing grounds that we talk about, and who has a stake in those, what do they look like? Because in my work, especially thinking about like how new spaces, not new, existing spaces become new modes of collecting data, and how that important that is. Like for me, looking at, say, activity recognition and movement data sets, that the application of those technologies is, I think, much further behind because the big data sets haven't been around for very long, which is different with object recognition, and people that are familiar with like the ImageNet data set. And so in my work, it becomes a question of, when you look at a product that comes out, to what extent is that product really serving its customer in the way it's intended, and what is it just a means of collecting data? And I think the most well-documented and discussed example of this is the Amazon Ring product, which I don't know if people have heard about, but it was very early on after the launch of that product that it was, people studied it and realized that the business model behind the product for Amazon was not to sell these smart doorbells to lots of consumers. The business model was that once they're in homes is to sell the data to police forces and local cities. And that's the real business model behind the product, is this kind of ability to capture data from public streets and things. And of course, there's still the convenience of the product as well. But so I think for me, the question of trust is kind of weaving around those things. But I'm really interested in how it plays out in a kind of more contained testing ground, like with your project.
Yeah, I mean, the medical situation, just the idea of how, I mean, questions I think a lot about is how do I know a thing is listening to me or is thinking, or how do I get those sort of like subconscious feedback mechanisms that it's actually like it's there, right? But also from the perspective, I mean, the Amazon comes up again in this as that software gets implemented in distribution warehouses, is workers are not able to like go to the bathroom, or like this idea of like productivity comes into play, where this actually leads to the next question about automation, is that it becomes almost it gets billed as this idea of like doing less work but has the opportunity to do more. And all these the examples of your work, I think the question of how, both as tool, as creative software, but also as okay. Okay, it was a dumb question anyway. Yeah. Anybody have a question?
So I had a question particularly in regards to building empathy and trust between humans and AI, and specifically empathy and trust in social relationships with AI. I wanted to ask, what are the bounds that we put on that? Because I think usually we associate empathy and trust with being very positive things. But for me personally, just reading, I don't know if any of you have seen this, but there was a New York Times article last year about this journalist who interacted with, I think it was Microsoft's AI, and they sort of broke these safety mechanisms and got it to say some very dangerous things. And I wanted to ask, what sort of limits should we put on these, specifically social relationships? Because I know that there's people that are building these very deep emotional relationships with AI, which I think could be quite dangerous, especially considering that they're limiting themselves, or they're sort of removing themselves from physical, like authentic relationships because of that, because it's easier and more accessible.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think part of the question actually gets to a very difficult problem in human-centered design, which is that on some level, if you take human-centered design to the nth degree, then you are thinking, well, in some cases you're thinking about very specific interactions between one human and one interface, and you're trying to make those as seamless, as pleasant, as addictive potentially as possible. And that kind of devotion to sort of like seamless HCI in a way is what has given us a lot of socially pathological software systems, right? I don't think I need to elaborate too much on that. And I think we're at this moment where we have a completely different kind of entity where the instinct may well be, let's humanize this as much as possible. But I think that lesson, the lesson of social media, frankly, on some level has taught us, hopefully, that we should pause there a bit. Do we really want these as human as they could be? I think there could be some challenges there. So, I don't have an answer, but I think this is part of the reason why I think some new paradigms around sort of like humanity-centered design or aspects of post-human design or those kinds of things, they begin to take a little bit more measured stance as to when you actually deploy the techniques of human-centered design in contexts where actually they could lead to other pathologies.
Yeah, and I have a few. It's a really important question. It's a great question, and there is an entire field of ethics right now that's emerging, and I think it's really important. This is a very multidisciplinary question. We need philosophers working on this. We need legal experts working on this, and ethicists, essentially. But from a designer's point of view, the way that I've always believed in approaching it, and what I hope that I communicated in my talk, is that I think that it's a misguided effort, as you were saying, to try to replicate the human, and it's a temptation, and it is something that we fall in love with in some kind of AI and designer as God kind of mythology, but in essence it's incredibly misguided, and it leads to a creation of a thing that seems like that fools us into thinking that it's something that it's not. So as a designer, at least in principles, what I really believe in is number one, abstraction, and number two, having interfaces that are necessarily communicating their non-humanness, so communicating a transparency. And in doing my research for the book, I enjoyed, talking with the CEO of that LQ product that I mentioned, and he said, we intentionally work on in making sure that it communicates that it's robotic or not human in some way. And I also have an interview with Jonathan Foster, who was the head writer leading the team for creating Microsoft Cortana, which is funny because it's another Microsoft product, but I know the exact article that you're talking about, and it was when, and I don't know if it was the Bing agent or that was first unleashed, and they quickly pulled it back. But I know for the Cortana team, he led them to intentionally anticipate certain situations, like anticipate when people were abusing the agent, to be able to shut the conversation down or say, I don't want to have this conversation, or I can't answer this. And I think it's an ongoing challenge.
So I can't really say anything about like the chatbot system, but I think there's something around the subfield of affective computing, which is sort of computer science's way of trying to model human emotion. And I've looked at some systems that use facial recognition to try and track and predict human emotions. And in terms of, you're asking about protections and risks, and I know that with those recent documents I was mentioning, the policy development documents, I know there's a lot of people who were really hoping in those documents that there would be specific regulations on effective computing, and there have not been any. And I know that effective computing seems to be of particular concern to a lot of people, including computer scientists, in the kind of potential risks that it holds, the ability to sort of predict our emotions. So yeah, that's all I know about that. But I think effective computing is sort of something to kind of, is interesting to follow the development of that. Yeah, I've never used one, but I've seen those, like, see a lot of adverts these days for like AI therapists, like cheap therapy. And I'm assuming there's some kind of effective system, maybe not from the face detection, but some kind of effective computing going on there.
Well, I think that the comment about not mimicking, moving away from this idea of mimicking human intelligence and making these things in our shadow or vision is really interesting. Back to what Amelia said earlier about how, and James Brattle talks about this a lot too, is like the range of intelligence. Like, this isn't like the first new intelligence. There's so many natural intelligences throughout the universe, and letting them be, like, exploring how they see and what they want to see and how those things work together is actually what I think is really exciting, to unpack that as that relationship grows.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about these emerging intelligences as things which are not necessarily human. Also, you know, the drive towards empathy. Empathy can also lead to manipulation, and I think that's one thing that I think is a little bit scary about this sort of impulse. But you know, there's an alternate way of thinking about this, which is to say, okay, well, we can think about these intelligences not as human, but instead as animal-like in some ways. There's a whole range of animals which have different sensory ecologies and sort of different approaches to being in the world. And we interact with animals, and we have for, you know, I don't know, I guess since the beginning. But I think there's a way of thinking about those animal-like qualities which might allow us to create the right amount of differentiation between ourselves and those AIs, which creates a kind of like some sort of like healthy social relationship. So the animal model also, like, was it like Kate Crawford? Kate Darling, yeah, has written some about this. So.
Yeah, what's our, we call it? Yeah, let's call it. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Osby. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone, panel. As I thank Jonathan for the panel, let me also tell you that we recently had a new degree approved officially that Jonathan's leading, and that is our new Master Design Program in Human Computing Interaction and Emerging Technology. So send students here in the fall of 25, and he can finish his questions then. So thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, everyone. That was a great panel. I have the pleasure to introduce now Ian Bogus, who's prepared to give some final remarks today. He's a great friend, a philosopher, computationalist, award-winning game designer, and an extremely prolific writer. He has 10 books and probably two more underway, one more underway, sorry. And he's also an ice cream maker, so you can ask him about that also. He's a contributing editor to The Atlantic, so hopefully if you haven't already, you should follow him. I'm appreciating his podcast right now on time. That's a very good segment. He's the editor of the Platform Studies book series about technical design and computing systems and its influence on creativity, and the Objects Lessons book and essay series about the secret lives of ordinary things, which I think Carla will relate to that. So that's a good reason to call him up here to give some summary remarks. He's also the Barbara and David Thomas Distinguished Professor and Director of Film and Media Studies and Professor of Computer Science and Engineering. Ian.
Okay. I guess I want the mic. Okay, we got to play with some technology here, so that's the end over here. It's over on this side. I can't so what are we seeing on the screen? We're seeing, how do I turn off? There we go, stop mirroring. Okay. I think we got it. I think we got it. I'm in the hot seat here to sum up, but I think I've got it. I'm really grateful to Carmen and everyone involved in organizing this second event. It's really been delightful, and it's been a particular honor and a special challenge to pay attention in a very peculiar way in order that I can try to draw some connections between everything that we heard and maybe a little of my own stuff, maybe, you know, as well. So this has been an architecture-oriented day, I would say, in terms of our approach, our kind of grounding in the questions of design and AI. Not exclusively so, but many of our participants come from that background. And I do not, although I got kind of accidentally mixed up with architects starting around 10 years ago, when a sort of strange troupe of philosophers I run in started reading our work on so-called object-oriented ontology. And I remember when this started to happen, when architects started reading our stuff, my stuff and my friend's stuff, I was very deeply concerned because in my understanding, architects were responsible for designing the built environment, and I didn't know if I wanted to have anything to do with that kind of influence. And so, like when this happened, you know, you ended up with just like this amazing stuff. Like Mark Foster Gage started like encrusting hypothetical 100-story skyscrapers with neo-Gothic, you know, like gargoyles and stuff. And this was supposed to be some kind of an expression of some of these conceptual principles that myself and my colleagues had been experimenting with. And Gage wrote, in fact, this line about it: the reframed philosophical context of O challenges, in particular, Deleuzian, Schumacherian parametricism, in which all parameters are constantly shifting but ultimately known, interconnected, procedural, and calculable, and offers the possibility of an architecture less predictable with experimental outcomes rather than one of forced obedience to the social and communicatory scripts outlined by the architect, which is quite a lot of words indeed. And at the time that this was happening in the last decade, I happened to be doing what felt like a very different kind of activity in which I was like weirdly deeply involved in land use politics in Atlanta, where I lived at the time. And so at the same time as like I was getting these like, you know, Graham Harman was sending me these Mark Foster Gage skyscrapers and stuff, I was looking at stuff like this kind of like ghastly faux prairie infill development kind of thing. Are you seeing? Are we getting my images, or is there an? It shouldn't be mirrored though, so I can see my. It's not. Maybe it's just that it disconnected. There we go. Okay, so this is why you didn't laugh at the gargoyles. There they are. I did have all those words on the page. Okay, here it is. Here's the ghastly faux prairie infill home that I was telling you about, and this felt like such a different process to me than the one that I was kind of half participating in with my new architect. Like the issue with this was that it appeared to be 3 stories, according to some, from a secondary frontage. This was a corner lot like this, and some claimed that you were only allowed to get to 2 stories in the land use regime we were working in. And so one of the questions was like, well, what is a 2-story structure? And is it the casement windows there that are the problem, or is it this like hip gabled outcropping thing? God, this is such an ugly house, right? But these are the kinds of things that people in the world actually build, whereas these are not, right? And so, you know, thinking about stuff like, well, what makes is a secondary frontage primary in some cases? Because, you know, the secondary frontage is actually kind of the primary frontage based on not where the door was, but kind of where the massing appeared in the area. And there were other questions about the way that essentially the way that patterns of height got measured is a different design. But anyhow, I remember being feeling insane in these meetings because no one was prepared to ask questions like, what is a 2-story home, or what constitutes a half story on a 12 and 12 versus 4 and 12 slope, or what have you. And this just felt very different from this activity, whatever it represented. And I bring this up because it was on my mind listening today as we were kind of thinking about what AI is capable of, what we want it to do, and what we want to avoid. So the fact that I'm able to make images like these at whim, that I don't even have to think about the effort required to produce them, it opens certain doors and closes others. And when you mentioned, when brought up and flagged this as bullshit, please no one put on the internet my picture of Mark Foster Gage's work with bullshit on the screen. But when you flagged this as a kind of bullshit, as a kind of not this, but this, right? Kind of persuasion without evidence, as a set of activities that don't tell us what to do. In his words, that seems right. That seems right to me. But then also, this also seems the same. Like it seems very similar to an accusation we could turn back on ourselves as a description of the conceptual design process. Maybe even as much. I mean, if we're being honest, right, as much of the kind of studio output that we produce, which remains largely conceptual and posed in order to pose questions rather than to intervene in the world. So I think that's a problem, a question for us to wrestle with. And as I was sort of collecting quotes and ideas today, ways of maybe getting to the bottom of this, of thinking about how to think about it, we had a great many. And I don't have them as organized as I'd like, but I just want to reshare some of the things that we heard, that I heard. This idea from Connor that Carol shared with us of epistemopathy, the feeling of knowing, the affect of knowing, but also the flip side of that, the feeling of knowing what you don't know, of flagging those overlooked features, which is a phrase that she used, and then pursuing that knowledge. That reminded me of that sort of conflict I had between, the plate height of a residential home and the gargoyles on the side of a skyscraper that's never going to get built, let alone the AI implementation of our dreams or our nightmares. So that was one thing. And then Amelia, several times raised this question of whose system, whose data, whose automation gets foregrounded. And she said, at one point, as if there's just one AI, which is on the one hand already true, but also an aspiration. I think that maybe there is something to Casey Reese's training of a model on a machine in the corner of his office for a month, even though that's hard. That some of this is going to be difficult, not because it's technically difficult, but because we're working against what's become a massive industry that's produced much easier ways of adopting domains of knowledge or aggregations of material that we didn't get to choose. And then kind of this whole afternoon session was really about kind of antidotes or paths out of that problem space, I think. Carla showed us use this phrase, many different tools for taking control of a whole set of possible futures, including a robot-assisted domestic future, which is really an interesting one, but is also just one example. We have to think about those possibilities and design for them in advance, perhaps before others do on our behalf. And Catherine also drew our attention to the other kind of ontology, the computer scientific notion of cataloging activities, which I used to think was this kind of weird, obsessive, hopeless dream. You mentioned ImageNet, and it was you go into these systems, WordNet, ImageNet, these old ontologies in the CS domain, and they were utterly broken, just random stuff connected to other things. But they were trying, what would it feel like to try to capture this knowledge? And so doing that with something like domestic activity, not so much in order to control it, but just to begin asking questions about, well, what is this activity even? How do we make it visible? How do we foreground it and celebrate it, and not simply go direct to policing it, which is perhaps what some industrial uses are most attempted to do. And Andrew's work also showed this similar approach to, like, using pattern recognition, that like little litany of animations of the building, materials is just so fantastic to me. A way of collecting everything, or at least some of the things that are out there, and asking, okay, well, here's some stuff. What can we do with this? I found that a very hopeful and productive message. So I wanted to consider all of that in the context that Matt framed the day around, which is this kind of playful return to Scott Brown of Venturi's famous, so famous that you almost don't notice anymore, approach to Las Vegas. And, to me, I think this is generally accepted too. I don't think this is controversial to say. That approach, the way that we've received that approach historically now, a long time ago, amounted to a process of an example, let's say that, an example of how to study cities for what they are, rather than as a lament for what they failed to be, or as some kind of abstract promise about what they might become. And I really don't think we do that very often anymore. Most of our discourse is about how terrible everything is, and how hopeless that terribleness also is. And it's just interesting to reflect on even the idea of celebrating like automobile culture in American urbanism. That's just not a very popular thing to do today, right? Even what it feels like to think about doing is, well, maybe that's not the kind of thing I'm going to post on the internet. So I heard this word quite a number of times today. Critical position, critical study, critical approach, and so on. And I just think that's an interesting place maybe to let our minds linger for a minute, because there's a number of ways that we could be critical, and there's the kind that amounts to criticality as like an attentiveness to detail, which is, I think, the Scott Brown Venturi lesson, if we take the best parts of it with us. And then there's critical in what I think has become its kind of like, default contemporary sense, which is oppositional. There's something wrong with the world, and we must oppose it. Even before we know what it is, we must oppose it, or we must adopt the position of the subject position of opposition, because that's what other subject position is there, really. And I just don't know. I mean, I think that if we were to look at AI in all of hopefully with all of its varieties, those existing and yet to be invented, as this kind of, anti-Le Corbusierism, like instead of like tear everything down and rebuild anew, like here's a bunch of stuff, like here it is. What is it even? What are we going to do with it? Then that's an interesting thought with which to move forward. We are, in a way, I think, both celebrating and mourning at the same time the world that AI is already offering us, even before we know what it is. And this has happened so fast, so much faster than any other technological transition I can remember. And we have that sense that many things seem dangerous, but many things also seem possible. We have to hold those two ideas in our heads at once and not let the one defeat the other, either one. So, the more types of knowledge that we imagining, and the greater diversity of tools and models that we develop, then the better able we may be to understand the world that tends not to get seen, and then to build things that would allow us to see and engage and design around them, whether that's, a plate height in residential infill construction or domestic work or whatever it is. That feels like an interesting way forward, like not just to make those activities more efficient or more widely accessible, but to help them thrive in what they already are, to make them even more what they already are. Okay, those are my thoughts, my concluding or summative thoughts. I hope I I hope I did it. Yeah.
I think you did.
All right.
I'm going to let Matthew have the last words, but I actually want to just make sure we properly thank him for such a great day. Thank you.
I don't have anything to add except to especially thank all of you who have made it here. You for these remarks here at the end, but people who've traveled here, and all of you for taking part in this conversation. And I'm going to thank you in advance for keeping it going just for a few more minutes in the reception downstairs. Thanks. Have a good afternoon.